The night was calm, and traffic was light as Steven Seagal drove down the highway after finishing a long business meeting across town. The city lights reflected off his windshield while soft music played quietly in the background. It had been a tiring day, and all he wanted was to get home and relax. As he changed lanes carefully and continued driving within the speed limit, flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. For a moment, Steven wondered if the police car was chasing someone else. But when the siren briefly sounded, he realized the officer wanted him to pull over. Steven calmly signaled and steered his car to the side of the road. Traffic stops weren't unusual, and he had nothing to worry about. He rolled down his window, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, waiting respectfully for the officer to approach. But from the very first moment, something felt off. Instead of a routine greeting, the officer walked up with a hard expression and a sharp tone. Without explanation, he demanded Steven's license and registration while shining a flashlight directly into his face. Steven politely handed over the documents and asked calmly, "Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer ignored the question and instead began asking unrelated questions: where Steven was coming from, where he was going, and why he was driving so late. The tone wasn't conversational. It felt more like an interrogation. A few passing drivers slowed down, sensing tension as the officer continued questioning him. Steven remained composed, answering briefly but respectfully, not wanting the situation to escalate unnecessarily. Sometimes situations escalate not because someone has done something wrong, but because misunderstandings or attitudes create unnecessary tension. In moments like these, staying calm often becomes the most powerful response. Back inside his car, Steven sensed the officer was trying to provoke a reaction. But years of martial arts training and life experience had taught him patience and control. He chose to remain respectful, even though the situation clearly felt uncomfortable. What Steven didn't realize was that this routine traffic stop was about to turn into something far bigger, something that passing drivers would soon begin recording, and something that would later spread across the internet. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a traffic stop that felt unnecessarily aggressive? Share your experience or opinion in the comments below. Steven Seagal sat calmly in his car as the officer walked back toward the patrol vehicle, holding his license and registration. The flashing lights continued to illuminate the dark highway, casting long shadows across the road. Passing cars slowed slightly, drivers glancing curiously at the unfolding scene before moving on. A few minutes passed, longer than a typical traffic stop. Steven noticed the officer speaking into his radio while occasionally looking back at him. Something about the officer's body language suggested tension rather than routine procedure. Then, unexpectedly, another police car pulled up behind the first one. Its lights began flashing as well, making the roadside glow with red and blue reflections. Steven frowned slightly, wondering why backup was necessary for what should have been a simple stop. The first officer returned, his tone now even more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered sharply. Steven blinked in surprise but remained calm. "Officer, may I ask what the issue is?" he asked respectfully. Instead of answering, the officer repeated the command, louder this time. A second officer approached from the passenger side, watching Steven closely as if expecting trouble. Not wanting the situation to escalate, Steven slowly opened the door and stepped out, keeping his movements controlled and visible. The cool night air hit his face as he stood beside his car under the bright patrol lights. The officers began questioning him again, where he had been, why he was in the area, whether he had been drinking, and whether there were any illegal items in the vehicle. The questions kept coming, one after another, without explanation. Meanwhile, traffic had started slowing further. A couple of drivers parked at a distance, sensing drama. Soon, a few bystanders stood on the roadside, some holding up phones and recording the interaction. Steven noticed cameras pointed toward him. In the modern world, nearly every public confrontation could end up online. Still, he stayed composed. "Officers," he said calmly, "I've cooperated fully. I'd just like to understand why I was stopped." One officer ignored the question and instead began looking through the car windows with his flashlight. The other stood close to Steven, almost trying to intimidate him through sheer presence. The tension in the air grew heavier. When authority figures allow emotions or assumptions to guide their actions, situations can quickly spiral. At times like this, patience and calm behavior become essential, even when someone feels unfairly targeted. Steven understood something important. Reacting emotionally would only make things worse. No matter how unfair the treatment felt, losing his temper could turn a misunderstanding into a serious conflict. Still, he sensed the officers were looking for an excuse to escalate further. As more cars slowed and more phones appeared, whispers spread among the small gathering crowd. People could sense the situation becoming uncomfortable, even dangerous. What began as a simple stop was now turning into a tense roadside confrontation. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, which country and city are you watching from right now? Let's see how global this audience really is. Back under the flashing lights, Steven took a slow breath, trying to keep the moment under control. But deep down, he felt this encounter was far from over. And in just a few minutes, the situation would take an even more dramatic turn, one that no one standing on that roadside expected. The roadside scene had transformed from a routine traffic stop into a tense public confrontation. Red and blue lights flashed across the dark highway as more vehicles slowed down, drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. Several bystanders now stood at a safe distance, phones raised, recording every moment. Steven Seagal stood beside his car, hands visible, trying to maintain calm despite the growing pressure around him. The officers, however, seemed increasingly determined to assert control over the situation. One officer began searching the exterior of Steven's vehicle, shining a flashlight into every corner as if expecting to find something suspicious. Another officer remained close to Steven, watching his movements carefully. "Spread your feet and keep your hands where I can see them," the officer ordered. Steven complied without resistance. He understood how quickly situations could spiral when misunderstandings mixed with authority and fear. Still, he couldn't ignore the feeling that the officers were treating him like a criminal without any clear cause. As the officer moved behind him, Steven suddenly felt a firm shove against his shoulder, forcing him harder against the car than necessary. "Stay still," the officer barked. The shove caught the attention of the nearby crowd. Murmurs spread among the onlookers. "Did you see that?" someone whispered while continuing to record. Steven slowly turned his head slightly, careful not to make sudden movements. "Officer," he said calmly, "there's no need to push. I'm cooperating." But instead of calming the situation, his response seemed to irritate the officer further. The tension thickened, like a storm waiting to break. More phones appeared, capturing the interaction. The officers seemed aware they were being filmed, yet their behavior didn't soften. Inside, Steven felt conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to demand proper treatment. Another part reminded him that losing control now could make things worse, for himself and everyone involved. In moments of confrontation, emotions can easily take over. But true strength often lies in controlling reactions when provoked. Many conflicts escalate simply because neither side is willing to step back. Steven's years of martial arts discipline taught him that the best fight is the one avoided. Yet, discipline also meant knowing when to stand firm without becoming aggressive. Meanwhile, the officer searching the car called out to his partner, frustrated. "Nothing here," he muttered. Still, the officers didn't step back. Instead, they seemed to double down, determined to justify their actions. One officer suddenly grabbed Steven's arm roughly, attempting to reposition him. The move triggered gasps from the small crowd watching. Steven instinctively adjusted his stance to keep balance, careful not to appear confrontational. His movements were controlled, measured, almost effortless, but clearly defensive. The officer, however, misinterpreted the movement. "Stop resisting," he shouted. The words instantly raised tension. Phones lifted higher as people sensed things might turn violent. Steven took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew resisting physically would make things worse. Yet he also knew he had the right to protect himself from unnecessary force. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Cars passed in the distance. The flashing lights reflected across worried faces in the crowd. The officers' voices grew sharper. And Steven stood in the center of it all, calm but alert. At this point, imagine yourself in this situation. If you were being treated unfairly, would you stay calm or defend yourself immediately? Comment below. Calm or react? What would you honestly do? Back at the roadside, the officers continued pressing him, their frustration visible as they failed to provoke the reaction they seemed to expect. Steven spoke again, voice steady. I'm cooperating. Let's keep this respectful. But tension was already too high. The officer gripping his arm tightened his hold, trying to force Steven into a more submissive position. It was unnecessary, and everyone watching could see it. Some people in the crowd began calling out, telling the officers to relax. Others warned them they were being recorded. The officer's authority, once unquestioned, now felt challenged by public attention. Steven's mind raced through possibilities. He wanted the situation to end peacefully. But he also knew something important. If things escalated further, he might be forced to defend himself, not out of anger, but necessity. The atmosphere was now electric, hanging on the edge of chaos. And in the next few moments, a single aggressive move would change everything. The officers didn't yet realize they were pushing a man whose entire life had been built around discipline, self-control, and self-defense. And soon, the balance of power at that roadside stop was about to shift in a way no one expected. The flashing police lights continued to pulse across the highway as tension lingered in the night air. Cars slowed as drivers tried to understand what was happening, and more phones remained pointed at the roadside confrontation. Steven Seagal still stood beside his vehicle, the officers close around him. The aggressive energy from moments earlier had not fully disappeared, but now something new was happening among the growing group of onlookers. Whispers began spreading. A young man standing near the crowd squinted at Steven through his phone screen as he recorded. Something about the calm posture, the unmistakable face, and the composed demeanor felt familiar. "Wait, is that Steven Seagal?" he asked quietly to the woman next to him. She leaned forward, looking more carefully. "Oh my God! I think it is." Within seconds, murmurs spread through the small gathering. "That's Steven Seagal." "No way, it actually is." People began whispering his name while continuing to record. Some drivers who had stopped earlier stepped out of their cars to confirm what they were hearing. The realization slowly moved through the crowd like a ripple. Yet, strangely, the officers involved still seemed unaware. They continued treating the situation like a routine confrontation, not realizing the man they were pressuring was one of the most recognizable action stars and martial artists in the world. Steven, meanwhile, heard the whispers but gave no reaction. His expression remained calm. He didn't try to use his identity to gain advantage. He simply stood there, composed, still cooperating despite the uncomfortable situation. Respect should not depend on fame or status. Whether someone is a celebrity or an unknown citizen, everyone deserves fair treatment. True character is revealed when someone chooses humility instead of using power or fame for personal benefit. The officers continued speaking among themselves, clearly frustrated that their search had turned up nothing. The roadside cameras and growing attention now added pressure. One officer glanced at the crowd, noticing more phones than before. "What are they all staring at?" he muttered. Another officer shrugged, focused instead on the interaction with Steven. But the whispers grew louder. "Man, they don't even know who they're dealing with," someone in the crowd said. A teenager recording excitedly whispered into his live stream, "Guys, this is Steven Seagal getting stopped right now. This is crazy." Online viewers began joining the live stream as the moment spread in real time. Yet Steven refused to acknowledge the growing recognition. He kept his voice calm and respectful when responding to the officers' questions, never mentioning his name or status. Inside, however, Steven understood the situation could easily turn into public humiliation for the officers if his identity became fully clear. But humiliating anyone wasn't his goal. He simply wanted the encounter to end peacefully. One officer stepped closer again, his patience clearly thinning. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the officer snapped. Steven looked at him calmly. "I'm not resisting. I'm just asking to be treated fairly." The officer seemed irritated by Steven's calm tone, as though the lack of fear or anger frustrated him. Behind them, the crowd's energy had changed. What began as curiosity now felt like anticipation. People were waiting to see how this would unfold. Some began debating quietly. Should they even be treating him like this? Even if he wasn't famous, this seems excessive. Others were simply shocked the officers hadn't yet realized who they were dealing with. Do you think fame should change how someone is treated in situations like this, or should everyone be treated the same? Share your opinion in the comments. Back on the roadside, Steven kept his composure. His years of discipline allowed him to separate emotion from action. He could feel the situation approaching a turning point. The officers were becoming defensive because of the attention. The crowd was becoming protective because they now recognized him. And Steven himself was reaching the limit of how much pressure he was willing to tolerate peacefully. The flashing lights, the cameras, the murmurs, the tense officers, all combined into a moment balanced on the edge of escalation. And still, Steven chose restraint. But the situation was far from over. Because in just moments, one officer would make a move that would force Steven to react, and the entire roadside scene would change in an instant. The tension at the roadside had reached a critical point. The flashing police lights, the murmuring crowd, and the growing number of cameras pointed at the scene created an atmosphere thick with anticipation. Everyone watching sensed that something major was about to happen. Steven Seagal stood calmly beside his vehicle, his patience nearly exhausted but his discipline still firmly in control. The officers, on the other hand, appeared increasingly frustrated. Their search had yielded nothing suspicious, and now the attention from the crowd seemed to pressure them even more. One officer, clearly irritated by the situation slipping from his control, stepped closer to Steven again. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," he ordered harshly. Steven slowly complied, placing his hands on the roof of his vehicle. He didn't want to provoke further conflict. But the officer's next move shocked everyone watching. Without warning, the officer forcefully tried to twist Steven's arm behind his back, applying unnecessary pressure as if attempting to make an arrest without explanation. Gasps rose from the crowd. Phones lifted higher to capture every second. Steven's instincts kicked in instantly. Years of martial arts training and real-life defensive experience took over, not out of anger, but pure reflex and self-protection. In one smooth, controlled motion, Steven shifted his weight and redirected the officer's grip, freeing his arm without striking him. The movement was precise, calm, and almost effortless. The officer stumbled slightly, caught off guard by how easily his hold had been neutralized. The crowd reacted immediately. "Whoa!" someone shouted. "Did you see that?" another voice exclaimed. The second officer stepped forward quickly, shocked by what had just happened. But Steven didn't advance or attack. He simply stepped back, hands raised slightly to show he wasn't trying to escalate anything. His voice remained calm. "I'm not trying to fight anyone," Steven said firmly. "But you don't need to use force. I've cooperated from the start." The officers hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. They hadn't expected resistance, especially not such calm and controlled resistance. There is a difference between attacking and defending oneself. True strength isn't about hurting others, it's about protecting yourself while avoiding unnecessary harm. In tense situations, controlled reactions often prevent chaos. The crowd's reaction shifted dramatically. People who had been quietly recording now openly expressed support for Steven. "He didn't even hit him," someone pointed out. "He just defended himself." Livestream viewers online began flooding comment sections, reacting in real time as clips spread across social media platforms. The officer who had tried to restrain Steven looked embarrassed and angry at the same time. Losing control in front of cameras and witnesses was the last thing he wanted. Trying to recover authority, he raised his voice again. "You're resisting police procedure." Steven shook his head calmly. "No," he replied. "I'm protecting myself from unnecessary force." "There's a difference." His calm tone contrasted sharply with the officer's rising frustration. For a brief moment, silence settled over the roadside. Even the crowd seemed to pause, sensing the importance of what was happening. Steven then spoke louder, his voice clear enough for everyone nearby, and every recording phone to hear. "Respect works both ways. Citizens should respect officers, but officers must also respect citizens. Authority doesn't mean intimidation." The words carried weight, cutting through the tension. Even some of the officers nearby seemed uncomfortable now, realizing the situation was slipping beyond their control. Do you think Steven was right to defend himself calmly, or should he have stayed passive even under pressure? Share your honest opinion in the comments. Back at the scene, the officer who had initiated the forceful move looked around, aware of the cameras, the crowd, and the growing public attention. For the first time, uncertainty replaced aggression in his posture. Steven lowered his hands slowly, maintaining distance and showing he wasn't seeking further conflict. His message was clear: he would not be bullied, but neither would he escalate violence. The balance of power at the roadside had shifted. The officers no longer looked fully in control, and the crowd's support for Steven was obvious. What had started as intimidation was now turning into public scrutiny. Yet the night still held one more turning point. Because just then, the sound of another approaching siren echoed down the highway, signaling the arrival of someone who would change the course of the entire encounter. And within moments, the officers would realize just how serious this situation had become. The tense silence that followed Steven Seagal's calm self-defense was suddenly broken by the sound of another siren approaching. Heads turned as a new police vehicle pulled up behind the existing patrol cars, its lights flashing brightly across the dark highway. The crowd parted slightly as a senior officer stepped out of the vehicle, scanning the scene quickly. It was clear from his posture and confident stride that he held authority over the officers already present. He walked toward the group, noticing the raised phones, the tense officers, and Steven standing calmly beside his car. "What's going on here?" the senior officer asked firmly. One of the officers began explaining, but his voice lacked the confidence it held earlier. "Routine stop. Subject became uncooperative," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. The senior officer's gaze shifted to Steven, and recognition immediately crossed his face. His expression changed from professional curiosity to clear surprise. "Mr. Seagal," he said. A ripple passed through the crowd as people realized the officers had finally understood who they were dealing with. The officers who had been aggressive moments earlier suddenly looked uneasy. Their confident posture faded as the situation fully registered. "Yes, officer," Steven replied calmly. "I've been cooperating the whole time." The senior officer glanced around, noticing the number of phones recording and the tense expressions on people's faces. He quickly understood that something had gone wrong. Turning to his team, he spoke sharply. "Step back. All of you." The officers obeyed, though reluctantly. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The aggression that dominated earlier now gave way to discomfort and uncertainty. Members of the crowd began speaking louder, some even clapping quietly in support of Steven. "He didn't do anything," someone shouted. "You guys were pushing him around," another voice added. The officers looked increasingly embarrassed under public scrutiny. Powerful moments often reveal true character. When authority is challenged publicly, the response shows whether leadership means responsibility or simply control. Respect must be mutual to maintain trust between citizens and those sworn to protect them. The senior officer faced Steven again. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said. "We'll sort this out." Steven nodded calmly, showing no anger. "I just want fairness," he replied. "Nothing more." The simplicity of his response struck many watching. Despite everything, he wasn't demanding punishment or revenge, just respect. Meanwhile, live-stream viewers and social media audiences were exploding with reactions as clips spread rapidly online. Thousands of comments flooded in, praising Steven's calm behavior. The officers who had escalated the stop now avoided eye contact, clearly aware their actions were being broadcast far beyond the roadside. Let us know in the comments. Do you think officers who misuse authority should face serious consequences, or should situations like this be resolved internally? Share your opinion. Back at the scene, the senior officer spoke quietly to his team, likely instructing them on how to handle the fallout. Whatever was said, their earlier aggression was gone. Steven then addressed the senior officer calmly, but loud enough for nearby cameras to capture his words. "Most officers do their jobs with honor," he said. "But when someone abuses power, it damages trust for everyone." The statement resonated with many watching. Even some officers nearby appeared thoughtful, perhaps reflecting on the situation. The crowd's mood had completely shifted. What began as fear of escalation had turned into relief and admiration. People started cheering lightly. "Respect, Steven," someone called out. Steven simply nodded, still refusing to celebrate the officer's embarrassment. His goal had never been to humiliate anyone. Instead, he demonstrated something far stronger: control, dignity, and restraint. The senior officer assured Steven he was free to leave. Officers returned his documents, now noticeably respectful. But before getting back into his car, Steven looked once more at the officers. "Stay safe," he said calmly. "And remember, people deserve respect." The words hung in the night air as he finally opened his car door. Yet, unknown to everyone present, the story was far from over. Because within hours, videos from this very roadside would spread across the internet, sparking debates, praise, and consequences none of the officers expected. And the world was about to witness how one calm response during a moment of pressure could change the entire narrative. By the time Steven Seagal finally drove away from the roadside, the tension of the encounter still lingered in the air. The flashing police lights faded behind him as he merged back onto the highway, but what had just happened was already spreading far beyond that quiet stretch of road. Multiple bystanders had recorded the entire incident. Some had streamed it live, while others immediately uploaded clips to social media platforms. Within minutes, videos began circulating online under headlines like "Traffic Stop Turns Dramatic After Officers Confront Steven Seagal" and "Steven Seagal Defends Himself Calmly During Police Encounter." By morning, millions of people around the world had watched the footage. Viewers saw how the stop escalated, how Steven remained calm, and how he defended himself without unnecessary violence. Many praised his composure and discipline under pressure. Comment sections exploded with debate. Some people criticized the officer's aggressive behavior, arguing that situations like this damaged public trust. Others pointed out how easily such encounters could have ended badly if emotions had taken over. Clips showing Steven's calm response and his statement about mutual respect spread especially fast. In today's digital world, moments captured on camera can influence public conversations overnight. One interaction can spark debates about authority, fairness, and responsibility across entire communities. News outlets soon picked up the story. Talk shows and online commentators discussed the incident, analyzing every detail of the encounter. Meanwhile, the police department involved announced that they were reviewing body camera footage and the actions of the officers during the stop. An internal investigation was launched to determine whether proper procedures had been followed. For the officers involved, the sudden attention was overwhelming. What they believed was a routine encounter had become global news. But Steven himself avoided media appearances. Instead, he released a brief public message through his representatives. In the statement, he avoided attacking the officers personally. Instead, he focused on a broader message. He emphasized that most officers serve honorably, but situations like this highlight the importance of accountability and respectful communication on both sides. His calm approach once again impressed many people. Instead of turning the incident into a personal victory, he used it as an opportunity to encourage better understanding between citizens and law enforcement. After watching everything that happened, what lesson do you think people should take from this incident? Share your thoughts in the comments. Online discussions continued for days. Some viewers said Steven's discipline showed how training and emotional control can prevent violence. Others argued that anyone, famous or not, deserves to be treated fairly. Supporters praised his restraint, noting that someone with his skills could have seriously injured the officers but chose not to escalate. Meanwhile, supporters of law enforcement reminded audiences that officers also face dangerous situations and must make quick decisions under pressure. The conversation grew into something larger than one traffic stop. It became a discussion about respect, responsibility, and how public interactions between authorities and citizens should be handled. Through it all, Steven returned quietly to his normal life, continuing his work and public appearances without dwelling on the incident. But the roadside encounter left a lasting impression on viewers worldwide. It showed that calm strength can sometimes speak louder than aggression. It demonstrated how one moment of discipline can prevent chaos. And it reminded people watching that dignity under pressure is often the most powerful response. If you believe respect should always go both ways, between citizens and authorities, and between people in everyday life, type respect in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about courage, discipline, and real-life moments that inspire, make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories coming soon. Because sometimes, the biggest victories are not won through force, but through control, wisdom, and respect.